Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
If someone had told me 10 years ago that my own mother would make me feel like an afterthought year after year, I would have rolled my eyes, maybe even defended her, saying she had a lot on her plate, or that she just forgot, or that birthdays weren't her thing. But the thing is, those excuses only work once or twice. After the third time, you start to see it for what it is: a choice, a pattern, a habit she never intended to break. My name is Claire. I'm 38 years old, and for the third year in a row, my mother completely forgot my birthday, but made damn sure my younger brother Jason had a full-blown carnival thrown in his honor, complete with a saxophonist, champagne tower, and those dumb little party favors no one actually keeps. But she insists on ordering every year because presentation is everything. I wish I could say it started recently, like something triggered this shift, but the truth is, it's been happening in smaller ways my whole life. I just didn't want to admit it, because what does that say about me? To be the daughter who didn't get picked. Last year, my birthday fell on a Thursday. I was working from home that day and kept my phone close, thinking maybe she'd call during lunch or after dinner. She didn't. Around 8 p.m., I called her instead. She answered on the third ring, sounded distracted, like she had just woken up or had company over. I said, "Hey," and waited. Nothing. She asked, "Everything okay?" Not a damn word about the date. So I said, "Yeah, I guess, just wanted to say hi." She responded, "Sweetheart, now's not a great time. Can I call you back tomorrow?" I never brought it up. Not once. Because there's only so many times a grown woman can beg her own mother to remember the day she gave birth to her without feeling pathetic. This year was different. My birthday came and went with no call, no text, not even one of those cold, obligatory Facebook posts that moms slap on your wall like a sticky note they forgot to toss in the trash. But exactly 9 days later, I got an invite to Jason's birthday bash, a private vineyard tour upstate with live jazz and catered brunch. There was even a note in the email saying, "Dress code, semi-formal, mom's orders." That's what really burned. Not the party itself, not the fancy details. It was the thought that she'd planned this entire event, picked out a dress code, coordinated schedules, and likely argued with the chef over menu choices, all while forgetting, for the third year in a row, that her daughter still existed. Let me give you some context. Jason is 3 years younger than me, charming as hell, never really grew out of that mommy's little star phase, and frankly, he never needed to. He always knew someone had his back, no matter how badly he screwed up. In high school, he got caught shoplifting. Mom called it a misunderstanding. In college, he flunked out of his first semester. She said the professors didn't recognize his creative potential. And when he blew through his third job in 2 years, well, obviously, that was just not the right environment for someone like Jason. Meanwhile, I've worked since I was 16, paid for my own car, took out student loans she never helped repay, and even now, I own my home outright, alone with no co-signers or bailouts. But none of that seemed to earn me even the courtesy of a 2-minute birthday phone call. This isn't about the birthday, not really. It's about what the birthday symbolizes. It's about a mother showing up for her child, taking one day out of the year to say, "I'm glad you're alive. I'm proud you're mine." That's what stings. That hollow space where warmth should be. And every year, when she skipped over mine and then pulled out all the stops for Jason, it felt like she was standing on a stage, looking right at me and choosing not to wave. The night after Jason's invite came in, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the email, rereading it like it might somehow change. Maybe she'd added a last-minute line, "Sorry for missing yours, let's celebrate together." But no, nothing. I sat there for hours, no music, no TV, just the hum of the refrigerator and the ugly silence of not being remembered. I didn't cry, not that night. Instead, I opened a notebook and started listing every year she'd missed. I even went further back, to birthdays from childhood. There were signs even then, like how Jason always got the new bike and I got a sweater from Sears. I didn't do it to hurt myself. I did it to stop lying to myself. Because when the people who raised you are also the ones who made you feel invisible, you have two options. You either convince yourself it's all in your head, or you face it. I was done pretending. And here's the part no one really talks about. How deeply humiliating it is to admit that your own mother just doesn't see you. It's not dramatic. It's not exaggerated. It's not one of those social media therapy quotes people post to sound profound. It's just real. I had spent my whole life trying to earn something that should have been given freely. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. I knew I had to do something different this time. I wasn't going to bring it up again. I wasn't going to call and pretend it didn't hurt. I wasn't going to give her another chance to shrug it off. This time, I was going to do something I'd never done before. I was going to disappear. Quietly, strategically. I wouldn't yell or confront. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't even warn her. I would simply become absent. And when she finally noticed, it would be far too late to fix it with cake or a last-minute apology. I didn't know what that would look like just yet. But I knew one thing. When people only notice your absence and not your presence, that's the clearest sign that it's time to go. And I was already halfway gone. The vineyard was exactly the kind of place that screamed exclusivity, with white pebbled paths leading to ivy-draped gazebos, and tables dressed in crisp linen, every detail manicured to reflect some upscale dream that never really fit with who we were growing up. Back when birthday cakes came from the supermarket freezer aisle and entertainment was Dad setting off sparklers in the backyard, while Mom reminded everyone not to trample her petunias. But somewhere along the line, things changed. Or maybe they just changed for Jason, who now stood in the center of this picture-perfect scene, wearing a navy blue button-down and that smug, relaxed grin that always made people think he had everything figured out. When in reality, he still lived in a 2-bedroom condo, partially funded by Martha, and had no idea how much a bag of groceries cost. I watched from a shaded spot near the bar, holding a glass of overpriced Riesling I didn't even want, and tried to understand how my mother could put this much effort, this much thought, into a celebration for someone who'd never once remembered her birthday, let alone offered to plan it. It was hard not to marvel at the sheer orchestration of it all. The musicians set up near the small pond played soft jazz, while servers floated around with trays of appetizers I couldn't pronounce, and a custom cake taller than a toddler stood off to the side, like a monument to maternal delusion. Each tier decorated with symbols from Jason's hobbies: photography, travel, and something abstract that looked like either a mountain or a broken compass. And then, of course, there was Martha, in a pastel silk blouse that probably cost more than my rent when I was 25, dabbing her eyes with a cloth napkin as she gave a toast that sounded less like a birthday tribute and more like a eulogy to a local hero. She spoke about Jason's resilience, about how proud she was that he had found himself this past year, and how she couldn't ask for a better son. I could feel my stomach tighten, not out of jealousy, God no, but out of that familiar ache, the one that creeps up when someone publicly erases your entire existence with a smile and a clink of a champagne flute. And then, the moment that sealed it. While everyone applauded, Jason lifted his glass toward Mom, who was already sniffling with pride, and joked, "Well, next year you'll have to top this, right?" She laughed and shouted, "You know I will, sweetheart. I've already got ideas." That was it. That was the moment I knew with a clarity so sharp it almost knocked the breath out of me. This wasn't forgetfulness or oversight. This wasn't some generational disconnect or a mother being bad with dates. This was a hierarchy, a pecking order, a system in which I had always been placed quietly, consistently, and deliberately second. And no matter how old I got, no matter what I accomplished or endured or offered, I would never rise to first. I didn't leave right away. I stayed for another hour or so, smiled when necessary, posed for a few photos, even laughed politely when Jason's friends cracked jokes about old high school stories I'd never heard, because I hadn't been invited to those parties. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said was already woven into the silence between us, between Martha and me, between the expectation that I would continue to show up, absorb the slight, and behave graciously, like a good daughter raised on self-sacrifice and muted disappointment. Later, as guests began to drift off and the sun dipped behind the vineyard's farthest hills, I stood at the edge of the parking lot, keys in hand, staring at the reflection of the fairy lights in my car's windshield. I thought about how easy it would be to confront her then and there, to corner her with a cutting remark or a demand for explanation, to force the issue in front of everyone so the truth could finally break open like a dropped wine glass. But I didn't. I knew better. Martha would just tilt her head, widen her eyes, and ask me what I was talking about. Accuse me of being dramatic, overly sensitive, maybe even jealous. She'd deflect, deny, and then later call Jason and cry about how she'd tried her best and couldn't understand what she did wrong. No, I wasn't going to give her that script. I was done playing my part. So instead of goodbye, I just left. No hug, no wave, no announcement. I got in my car, drove down that gravel path, and didn't look back. I didn't cry, not even when I pulled into my driveway and sat in the dark for nearly an hour with the engine off, the house quiet, and the email from last week still unread in my inbox. I just sat there, letting the quiet wash over me, letting the absence of guilt take up space where grief usually lived. Because for the first time, I wasn't mourning what I didn't get. I was preparing to stop pretending I ever would. And that's when it hit me, not just the pain, but the absurdity of it all. I was nearly 40 years old, still waiting for my mother to treat me like I mattered, still hoping for crumbs at a table that was never meant for me. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was finally, undeniably clear. If love had to be earned, then it wasn't love at all. And if being forgotten was the worst she could do, then being remembered only when it was convenient wasn't worth craving. They didn't know it yet, but I was already gone, not in body, but in every other way that counted. And soon they'd feel it, not with anger, not with noise, but with silence. A silence so deep it would echo louder than any confrontation ever could. It didn't happen all at once, because silence is never a loud decision. It creeps in inch by inch, like water under a closed door, until one day you realize the room you're in has already started to flood, and you're standing there soaked, wondering when exactly it began. I didn't wake up the morning after Jason's party with a grand plan or some burning need to punish anyone, but something inside me had shifted in a way that wasn't reversible, like a rope that had been worn thin over years of quiet tension had finally snapped. Not with a bang, but with a soft, tired pop. The kind of break you don't try to mend. And so I did what most people don't expect from the so-called good daughter, the one who always showed up even when it hurt, who smiled through her mother's indifference and laughed politely when relatives asked why I didn't visit more often. I vanished. At first it was subtle, the kind of withdrawal that could be chalked up to being busy or needing space, and I made sure not to leave any breadcrumbs that might lead to confrontation. I let my phone go to voicemail, not because I was avoiding anything specific, but because I simply didn't want to explain myself anymore, not to people who never really listened in the first place. The texts came slowly, one from Martha, asking if I'd gotten home safely after the party. No mention of my birthday, no acknowledgement of the cold silence that hung between us at the vineyard, just a flat, obligatory check-in that felt more like a formality than a gesture of care. I didn't respond. The next day, Jason sent me a selfie of himself holding a glass of wine with the caption, "Best birthday ever, thanks for coming, sis." As if my attendance somehow meant participation. As if my physical presence was enough to cover the gaping hole left by years of emotional absence. Again, I didn't respond. I left it unread, not out of malice, but because I no longer felt the need to play along with the illusion that everything was fine. And that's the thing people don't tell you about cutting contact or going silent. It doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels lonely and weirdly guilty. And there's a part of you, especially when you're the one who's always been expected to bend, that whispers, maybe you're being cruel. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe this isn't such a big deal. But then you remember every time you sat across from your mother, waiting for her to ask how you were really doing, and she never did. You remember every time she posted about Jason's new promotion or weekend getaway while forgetting your own accomplishments like they weren't worth even a mention. And slowly, the guilt fades. It doesn't vanish, but it becomes something you can live with. 2 weeks passed, then 3. I didn't return the calls, and I didn't send the usual check-in texts. No, how are you, Dad? No forwarding memes to the family group chat. The silence stretched, and at first no one noticed. Or maybe they did. But no one dared bring it up because if they acknowledged my absence, they'd have to admit they noticed it. And if they noticed it, that would mean they knew what they'd done. And silence is only golden until it becomes a mirror. By the 4th week, the tone changed. My phone lit up one Sunday afternoon with a missed call from Martha, followed by a voicemail where she tried to sound breezy, but couldn't quite hide the edge of unease in her voice. Hey, Claire, haven't heard from you in a while. Just checking in. Everything okay? Call me when you get a chance. Love you. That last part, the love you, landed awkwardly like a line she wasn't sure still applied, but tossed in anyway, hoping it might stick. I listened to it twice, then deleted it without saving. The real shift came not from Martha or Jason, but from the sudden increase in group messages from extended family. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in 6 months sent me a heart emoji with no context. A cousin I barely knew tagged me in a throwback photo on Facebook. And Jason, oblivious as ever, texted me. Mom's been kind of worried. She says she hasn't heard from you in weeks. What's going on? I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard, debating whether to type out something diplomatic or biting, something that might offer clarity or at least catharsis. But in the end, I locked my phone and walked away, because I knew what I'd type wouldn't matter. Jason had never seen it, not really. He was too busy shining under the spotlight to notice anyone else was still standing on the stage. The thing about ghosting your own family is that it doesn't feel like justice. It feels like surgery, necessary, painful, and without anesthesia. You mourn what never was while cutting out the infection that's been growing for decades. And in those early weeks, I learned something I hadn't expected. People don't panic when you disappear, not at first. They assume it's temporary, a phase, something you'll snap out of. But when weeks turn into a month, and the silence stays steady, clean, and unyielding, that's when the fear creeps in. Not because they miss you necessarily, but because your absence forces them to look at what they were blind to for so long. And most people can't handle the truth unless it's wrapped in forgiveness. I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. Maybe not ever, because forgiveness to me had always been code for let's move on without fixing anything. And I had moved on, but I wasn't interested in pretending nothing had happened. They were starting to feel my absence, and they didn't like it. But me, for the first time in years, I was starting to feel something like peace. Unfamiliar, yes. Uncomfortable, absolutely, but real. And sometimes, real is enough. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical when it happened. And maybe that's what made it feel all the more intrusive, because when someone shows up unannounced at your job, carrying a forced smile and an emotional agenda, you're not dealing with raw emotion anymore. You're dealing with something carefully wrapped in the illusion of maternal concern, the kind that insists everything can be solved if you'd only stop being difficult and return to your assigned role in the family script. I was 2 hours into a staff meeting when the front desk buzzed me, said someone named Martha was in the lobby, and wouldn't say why she was there, but said it was important, which, coming from my mother, could mean anything from someone died to she couldn't find the right kind of basil for her pasta sauce. I stood up, heart sinking in that familiar childhood way, when you know you're about to be talked at, not talked with, and nothing you say will land because the other person's version of reality is already locked in, and walked to the lobby with a calm, detached expression that I hoped would protect me like armor. She looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe it was just that I hadn't seen her without a crowd around her in so long that I forgot how her confidence always needed an audience. She was dressed in one of her 2 neat cardigans, hair perfectly styled, lips pressed into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, as if we hadn't gone nearly 2 months without speaking. as if I hadn't already made it clear, in the clearest language I knew, silence, that I needed distance. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, voice light, falsely casual, already rehearsed. I said nothing for a second, then nodded once, just enough to move the conversation out of the public eye. We walked outside, stood beneath a sad-looking maple tree near the parking lot, and I waited for her to start. She launched right into it, as I expected, skipping past anything that would indicate self-awareness or reflection, instead focusing on how concerned she'd been, how worried she was about me not answering calls, how she thought something terrible might have happened. I didn't say a word. She paused, scanning my face for some emotional cue, and when she didn't get one, she shifted gears. "Claire, if this is about your birthday, you have to know that wasn't intentional," she said, drawing out the words like they were painful, like forgetting her daughter's birthday was some tragic misstep that fate had dropped on her doorstep, instead of a habit she'd repeated 3 years in a row. "Things have just been stressful," she added, using the same excuse she's used my entire life when she forgets, dismisses, or overlooks the things that matter to me. I didn't roll my eyes, but I wanted to. "You've had time to plan Jason's vineyard party for 2 months," I said calmly, quietly, no venom, no rage, just the kind of flat truth that makes people squirm because it offers no wiggle room, no emotional out. "You picked a caterer, wrote a toast, even emailed a dress code, but you couldn't remember the day I was born." She blinked, and I could see her mouth twitch, like she was deciding whether to defend herself or cry. Because those were her 2 gears, attack or martyr. She chose martyr. "Claire, that's not fair," she said, voice quivering now, as if my observation was some kind of cruelty, rather than the bare minimum of acknowledgement. "I've always tried to be a good mother. Maybe I'm not perfect, but..." I cut her off. "You don't have to be perfect," I said, more sharply than I intended, but the words had already left my mouth, fueled by years of swallowing down the urge to speak plainly. "You just had to care, and not only when it made you look good." That stopped her, for the first time in years. She didn't have a comeback. Her face flickered through several expressions: shock, defensiveness, something like guilt, though I wasn't naive enough to believe it would stick. "Jason needed more from me," she said suddenly, like it was a confession, but also a justification. "He always needed more. You were always so independent. You didn't need me the way he did." That sentence hit like a slap, not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed what I had always suspected deep down, but never dared to say out loud. I didn't get less because I was less. I got less because I was capable, and instead of being celebrated for it, I was punished, overlooked, forgotten, treated like an afterthought because I didn't require saving. She had mistaken my strength for abundance, my silence for indifference, and my independence for immunity to emotional abandonment. I stared at her, unable to find words that would fully express the betrayal embedded in that logic. How do you explain to someone that loving one child more visibly, more loudly, more consistently isn't a response to need, it's a decision? "You know what hurts more than being forgotten?" I finally said, voice lower now, steadier. "Being gaslit into thinking it's my fault for noticing." Martha looked at me then, truly looked, maybe for the first time in years, and I think some small, fleeting part of her understood what I meant. But if it did, it passed quickly, replaced by that all-too-familiar expression of vague discomfort and emotional retreat. "I just want us to be close again," she whispered, which would have been touching if it hadn't come after decades of emotional distance. "I don't think we ever were," I replied. And that was the end of it. She left without hugging me, didn't cry, didn't scream, just turned and walked back to her car, like she didn't know how to fight when the usual tools, guilt, denial, public performance, didn't work. I watched her drive away, a strange calm settling over me, the kind of peace that doesn't come from winning an argument, but from finally refusing to have it. In the days that followed, the messages stopped, the calls dwindled. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel tethered to a woman who only remembered me when I was useful, performative, or silent. I had said my piece, and now I was free. There's a strange kind of weight that settles on your shoulders when you finally let go of something you've carried for so long that its presence had become indistinguishable from your own posture, like wearing a backpack for hours until you no longer register its burden, only to take it off and realize that the heaviness wasn't part of you. It was just something you got used to. That was how it felt in the weeks and months after I told Martha the truth and walked away. Not with a dramatic exit or any kind of finality that could be wrapped up neatly in a bow, but with the kind of quiet, deliberate disengagement that doesn't beg for validation or applause, only space. I moved cities that spring, not because I was running, but because I wanted to feel what it was like to build a life without her shadow creeping into every decision, without the obligatory Sunday dinners that felt more like emotional performance art than genuine connection, without the guilt that clung to me like secondhand smoke every time I dared to choose myself. The new city wasn't glamorous or particularly special, it was just mine. I rented a modest 2-bedroom apartment with tall windows and creaky floors, found a local cafe where the barista learned my name after the second visit, started walking every morning not for fitness but for sanity, for clarity, for the stillness that only comes when no one knows your name or your story or the roles you were once expected to play. I began painting again, not well, not seriously, just enough to make my own walls feel like they had stories to tell. I even started seeing a therapist, which was something Martha had always rolled her eyes at when I'd suggested it in the past. Talking to strangers about your problems doesn't fix anything, she'd say, conveniently forgetting that talking to her had never fixed a damn thing either. In therapy, I unpacked things I didn't even know had weight. The constant comparison to Jason, the way I learned early to dim my successes so he wouldn't feel overshadowed, the way Martha weaponized gratitude like a leash, making me feel guilty for not being more appreciative of her efforts, even when those efforts were inconsistent, conditional, and often self-serving. One afternoon, nearly a year to the day, after Jason's vineyard spectacle and my silent disappearance, I got a text from him, a simple, short message that read, "Hey, just so you know, Mom hasn't been doing great. She talks about you a lot, cries sometimes." I stared at it for a long time, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know what kind of reaction it was supposed to elicit. Was it an invitation to return? A veiled guilt trip? A subtle way to suggest that her pain was now my responsibility? A debt to be paid for the crime of absence? I typed and deleted several replies before finally deciding to say nothing. Not because I was being cruel, but because I had nothing left to give to a woman who had spent her life rationing affection like it was currency, and I had never earned enough of it to matter. My birthday came a few weeks later, and for the first time in years, I celebrated it without checking my phone for missed calls or wondering if a card might show up late in the mail as some half-hearted attempt at reconciliation. I bought myself a small cake, the kind with too much frosting and a ridiculous plastic topper that said, "You did it," even though it wasn't clear what it was, and I invited 3 friends over, people who had no idea about the intricacies of my family dysfunction, people who liked me for reasons that had nothing to do with blood or obligation. We sat on the floor, drank cheap wine, and told stories until midnight, and when I blew out the single candle, I didn't make a wish. I didn't need to. The peace I had was not something that needed improvement. It was enough. A few days after my birthday, a letter arrived. Not a card, not an email, an actual handwritten letter in an envelope with familiar, precise cursive across the front. Martha. The handwriting was unmistakable. Always neat, always careful, always trying to present a polished front, even when the contents were a mess. I sat with the envelope for a full hour before opening it. Not because I feared what it would say, but because I already knew. And when I finally unfolded the pages, there it was. 3 long paragraphs of emotional gymnastics, carefully crafted to sound like vulnerability, but written with the unmistakable tone of someone still trying to explain why she had done what she did without ever fully owning the impact. She wrote about how hard it had been to be a mother, how she had done the best she could with the tools she had, how she never intended to hurt me, how Jason had always needed more, and she hadn't realized how much that took away from me. And then, in the final lines, so neat, so sterile, it said, "You always needed too much from me. I just wasn't equipped for that." I reread that sentence 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting the arrogance dressed up as honesty. I folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and tucked it in a drawer, not to cherish, not to revisit, but as proof, not of her love, but of my clarity. I didn't write back. I didn't call. I didn't mention the letter to anyone, not even to my therapist. Because some things don't need closure, some wounds don't heal with apologies, especially the ones that were never acknowledged while they were still bleeding. My revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't loud or messy. It didn't come with slamming doors or angry phone calls. It came with choosing my own peace over their panic, with walking away not in anger, but in certainty, with living a life where I didn't have to shrink or shout just to be seen. And maybe that's the real gift I gave myself, the ability to be whole, even if the people who were supposed to make me feel complete never bothered to try. They finally noticed I was gone, but not enough to ask why I left.